Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's 7 Tough Questions for Security Leaders webinar. My name is Michael Holden from Bytes. I'm pleased to be joined today by Adam Palmer, Chief Cybersecurity Strategist from Tenable, and Richard Cassidy, Senior Director of Global Security Strategy from Exabeam, who will be talking us through the bulk of today's presentation. Just some quick housekeeping. Attendee lines will be on mute throughout the session. There will be a Q&A at the end, so please post any questions in the questions window and they will be fielded during this Q&A. This is a purely strategic discussion and any commercials can be discussed with your Bytes account manager after the session. Everyone will receive the recording after the session. And lastly, we have a feedback form at the end of this presentation, and it would be appreciated if you could take 2 minutes to complete it, as we use this to make sure our webinars are hitting the mark. So, the agenda for the webinar. Firstly, a short overview of Bytes. We will then move into the majority of the presentation from Adam and Richard, which will look to answer the 7 tough questions for security leaders, including how to manage the new threat landscape, what real-world security mistakes we can learn from, how should I plug security blind spots, and more, which will then be followed by our Q&A. So, who are Bytes? Bytes enable effective and cost-efficient technology sourcing, adoption, security and management software, hardware, and cloud services. Bytes have a wide range of expertise, including licensing and cloud, data management, and security. On the security side, we have a wide range of technology partners with the highest level of accreditation with the majority of our vendors. We offer a variety of technical services, hold multiple accreditations, and boast award-winning delivery, which we are extremely proud of. That's enough about us. Let's talk about some tough security questions. As mentioned previously, we are joined by Adam Palmer, the creator of the UN Global Program Against Cybercrime, and now the Chief Cybersecurity Strategist at Tenable, and Richard Cassidy, the Senior Director of Global Security Strategy at Exabeam. Bytes are a top-tier partner of both Tenable and Exabeam. Tenable are a Forrester market leader in vulnerability risk management, and Exabeam are a Gartner market leader in SIEM. Who better to answer some tough questions security leaders are faced with? With that, over to you, Richard.
Super. Thank you so much indeed. So, hello everybody, wherever you're listening in from across the world. We are going to get through all of these questions as best we can, and we've got quite a bit to get through. And the way that we'll run this is both Adam and I will kind of tackle the questions from our own experiences and viewpoints. Much of them will be aligned, but we've come from very kind of different backgrounds, so we'll bring a little bit of a contrast to our view on tackling these particular points, which are very, very pertinent in the industry. A little bit about me. So I've been in the industry for about 20 years or so. Have lots of outside interests other than cybersecurity. And I mean, to put it in a nutshell, I've helped thousands of organizations over the past 20 years build and architect and implement security infrastructures, mitigation response programs. I've also been involved in building SOCs, managing SOCs, threat hunting, and sort of persona mapping projects for large corporates. So really worked kind of on the offensive side and defensive side of security ops for customers. So I'll bring a lot of that experience to what I'm going to talk about today in terms of answering these tough questions that we have, and hopefully that will give you some really good insights into how to manage your own strategies and your own processes when it comes to kind of getting the edge in some of these key areas. So let's deal with the first question. How do we manage the new threat landscape as that pertains to a lot of different things? And I always kind of start with this view when I speak to a lot of organizations, right, is that the threat landscape hasn't changed, in my opinion, significantly. Now, don't get me wrong, the tools, techniques, and procedures may have changed somewhat, but the general ethos and sort of tactical approach that cyber criminals take, or nation states, is essentially very similar. I'm going to take you through kind of the 5 stages of a breach from an adversary's perspective in a moment. But actually, the breach itself doesn't begin when an adversary shows up in your organization's environment, however so they might have done that, and then start to exfiltrate data or gain a foothold for kind of more nefarious tactics down the road. What we're finding, and what you will find in your own organizations, is that the breaches themselves will have happened long before, in the sense that poor policies, poor implementations of frameworks, not following best practices, for example, will all be this house of cards of the kind of security framework that will come crashing down very quickly if we're not building strength in each of those core key and component parts. And if we look at June, for example, right, the top 5 cyber attacks of June, they're all based around things like phishing, ransomware, and sort of credentials-based malware theft. And if we think about those 3 in isolation, that's not new, right? We've been seeing those kinds of threat vectors for the past 20 years. So what we're really looking for is, how is this new work dynamics era, right, of a global pandemic kind of exposed these legacy issues and opened up organizations in a way that perhaps is kind of supercharging what we've been used to, and giving us a bigger mountain of alerts to deal with in each of these key areas, which in of itself becomes a large problem, because then you kind of get a lack of ownership, a lack of policy and protocol capability in terms of delivery. And that leads to a greater potential of a breach as a result of some of these kind of standard legacy-based cybersecurity challenges that we might be facing. Now, one of the things we'll cover in this question as well is sort of what do we think about how this pertains to operational technologies, things like sort of cloud security practices. But actually, in terms of the managing the new threat landscape, what we have in the industry, and I think what we developed, is essentially an effectiveness problem. Tools have been, developing at a rate of knots in terms of the capabilities, and they all purport to have a level of effectiveness against particular threat vectors and types out there in the industry. But actually what we're seeing is the way that you're implementing these tools to manage the attacks across the threat landscape is the challenge, right? It's how are you articulating that data in context to what are you protecting, where does it sit, and who you're protecting it from. So in managing the new threat landscape, one of the key things we have to understand is, what are we up against? And actually, the cybercrime ecosystem hasn't really changed a great deal. It's become more complicated in terms of the different streamlines, but how data is monetized and how cyber criminals move information around and how they share and sell and sort of develop as a service methodologies between one another is something that's been very well oiled and very well defined. It's just become much more efficient at doing it. And if you realize that any amount of data can be monetized, then you'll start to understand the better ways to use the data you already have, to use the tool set you already have to help protect those key assets in a much more effective way. And I'll finish on this point when we talk about managing the new threat landscape. Remember, always understand the attacker's mindset when we think about breach operations and how they operate. And a lot of the stuff that they're going to be doing is outside of your purview. You're not going to be able to see how they define the targets, define goals. A lot of this will be based on threat intel feeds, etc. And then that reconnaissance phase tends to happen a lot now in social media and in open source intelligence networks. So you really have to look at controlling your organization's footprint in terms of social media and the data that you're putting out there on the open source wires, because a lot of this information makes it very easy for these attackers to do these targeted spear phishing and ransomware and malware campaigns. But beyond that, when they get to the sort of plan, penetrate, and operationalize phase, they're still using standard tool sets that we've been seeing for the past sort of 10 years or so. And actually, all these data points are very easily captured if we're looking for them in the right way, if we're implementing the right processes, the right frameworks, if we're looking at our data in a what am I protecting, who am I protecting it from, where does it sit function, then we're going to be able to stay ahead as the threat landscape starts to change. And it will do, and it has been exponentially over the past couple of decades at minimum. And look, I'll hand over to Adam for his view on this question, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an insight into the frameworks and the processes of these attacker groups and kind of what we could be doing better with our existing data sets to stay ahead of the game. Adam?
Thanks, Richard. Again, my name is Adam Palmer, and I am the Chief Cybersecurity Strategist for Tenable. I'm actually based in Dublin, Ireland, and I have worked in cybersecurity or related areas for about the last 20 years. I was a CISO for a technology company in Washington, D.C. Most recently, I was based in Spain, where I worked for a large European bank as a global director for cyber risk. And I'll share my views on the attack surface, and I echo everything that Richard said, but I would add to it that really at Tenable we view that the attack surface is really expanding. I'll give a very practical example of that from my own experience working at the bank. I think or any of my prior operational jobs when I was maybe sitting in the same seat as many people who are listening to this, I was really focused on the traditional IT assets. So the servers, the laptops, the mobile devices, and really only to the later stages of my career did I start to move into looking at cloud-based infrastructure. And so I think that this is where a lot of security leaders still focus, but that attack surface is really expanding, and it's creating a gap. So at Tenable, we call that a cyber exposure gap, and we see it being exploited by attackers. So what I would urge you to really look at in your environment is look beyond those traditional IT assets you might be very familiar with, but start considering all the vulnerabilities in your cloud environment and also your operational technology environment, your OT environment. I think this is a significant blind spot for a lot of organizations, and particularly in production or manufacturing facilities, for sure, you have these sometimes 20-year-old obsolete devices that still connect to your network. These are the PLCs and controllers. They multiple configurations. There's probably no record kept on them. Again, they may be completely different. You're used to Microsoft devices. This could be a device manufactured by Siemens, so a heavy manufacturing device, but doesn't have to be. These could be smart devices in your high-tech environment. So think of your HVAC controllers or smart connected access controllers. So IT, I think, is really a significant blind spot for a lot of security leaders. And one of the problems I think we have in finding all the assets is the type of legacy vulnerability management tools and methods that we use for scanning those devices. And I like to say, and I think a lot of people at Tenable feel, is that you can't protect what you can't see. So it's really important to look beyond a theoretical view of risk vulnerability, but really look at what assets you really have and being able to see those assets. I think that a lot of the security organizations that I work with, and I talk to a lot of CISOs and our customers, and they say that one of their greatest challenges is just seeing all the assets in their environment. And I think they struggle with this because sometimes the approach as well that they're taking with just simply scanning, not using authenticated scans, not using agents, and focusing too much on that sort of lower level, most basic level of vulnerability management. And then along with that, there's really a lack of prioritization. I think there's a prioritization crisis that goes with that. And so it's being able to focus on what matters most. And we'll talk about that a little later. But, a lot of organizations look at CVSS scores, and that's what they focus on. But so many of those, 56% of those are critical or high. So if you're focused on that, you get lost in a sea of vulnerabilities, and you're not focused on what's the most critical. And that's why it's really key. To avoid that, you have to use prioritization and be able to focus predictively on what's going to be the most risk to your organization. And really quickly, I'll just close out kind of to say that, regarding cloud, you have to really have the ability to detect all the cloud instances in your environment, Docker hosts, web applications in production, really get visibility of your environment, and have a platform that enables you to see all of those cloud-based data and assets that you have, as well as containers. Containers can have really a short lifespan, and that makes them incredibly difficult to detect using often traditional scanning approaches that we see. It makes it that they're hard to assess. And so I think that one way that you can really get your head around containers is working with your DevOps team, integrating with them, integrating vulnerability assessments so that you see those assets and you see what the critical risks are, and you're part all the way through the testing. You have an automated process. You're proactive. You're not involved with last-minute detection. I think too many security teams, they bolt on security at the last minute, especially in the DevOps process. And when security is really embedded from the inside out, it's much harder for a threat actor to break into your environment. And I think, finally, and this is something Richard echoed, my last point would be that everybody really has to be a part of the security team. So if you're talking about anything from the cloud environment and being able to and looking at all across and having visibility as to what's occurring within and plugins within each of your Azure or AWS or whatever, and being able to really look at visibility across your entire cloud environment or into your OT with your physical security team and engineers that may manage that, as well as your DevOps team. Once they're all part of your operation, even if they're different parts of the business, that's going to give you a holistic ability and vision of that attack surface. Hello?
Richard, I think you are muted.
Richard, yeah, you're muted.
Yeah, hi guys, I'm back again. So moving on to the next question, and Adam's covered some phenomenally critical points that are going to echo across all of these questions. And one of the things I'd like to pick up on before we jump into the next one around vulnerabilities and threats, and where should you start, right? Which one should you start first? Operationalizing security in your organization is, I think, the biggest consistent failing that I think both Adam and I will have seen in our time in the industry. And Adam raised a fantastic point around sort of this DevOps, this DevSecOps approach. Organizations build operations into finance, into sort of human resources, and into managing the business overall. But security tends to be seen as a team that is reactive to the state of kind of risk or security alerts. But actually, if we can bake in the security operations as a fabric core part of the business, and we involve all the teams and everybody is aware of their roles and responsibilities in terms of, again, what we're protecting, where it sits in terms of our data assets, and who or what we're protecting it from, then you're going to be in a much better state. And that starts, right down at the technical level in the software development lifecycle, and it doesn't end when we talk about sort of detection and response and mitigation. It ends when every person in the business is a stakeholder for security operations and the outcomes of security for the business. So that kind of brings us nicely to, so where do we start when we think about vulnerabilities and threats? Well, it's not hard to kind of look to what are the recurring, constant bad guys that show up in terms of these vulnerabilities and threats that we're seeing in the industry today. And actually, one of the key ones that I want to talk about is this age of kind of errors, or what I call errorism, right? So we're starting to see, a resurgence of configuration errors, for example, things like broken authentication mechanisms, sensitive data exposure, broken access control mechanisms, and probably the biggest one, right, security misconfigurations, which are making it just insanely easy for very unsophisticated attackers to find a weakness in a particular infrastructure and exploit it, right, without a great deal of capability or tool sets. And this gets even worse when we think about IoT. And if you're an organization that is adopting IoT, and you will be in some ways, but some more so than others, whether we're talking about IP-based CCTV systems, whether we're talking about smart devices in the office, or in this case at the home, right? Because the user's home network is now the new office cubicle. We're introducing a significant new threat vector or an expanded surface of threats through these operational technology devices. So we have to understand that if we're not ensuring that the configuration is correct, that all of these standard things like authentication mechanisms, access control mechanisms, where our sensitive data sits, what are the trust domains between sensitive data and those that are accessing it, if we're not looking into initiatives and frameworks around this, then we're not really in a great starting point in terms of helping to kind of win, in some respects, the constant sort of cat and mouse game around vulnerabilities and threats. Now, in addition to that, I talked a little bit earlier about sort of cybersecurity effectiveness and taking the existing tool sets that we have and making sure that we're taking the data points that matter to our business, to our data assets. And as Adam mentioned earlier, we're baking them into security processes and best practices frameworks that has everybody's key stakeholder, and we're owning the process from when the data is created to where it's finally stored and backed up and kept at rest. So where you start is essentially taking a look at your organization, looking at the data that you've got, how it's accessed, where it's accessed from, and making sure you have these policies and procedures and controls in place. But if I was to take one of the biggest risks that organizations that I'm seeing in the very recent past, over the past 3 or 4 years, where they're constantly failing, it's in credentials-based security controls and access. And credentials are absolutely key to attackers in the industry. In fact, almost all malware, if you have a look at how it propagates, it's looking to get credentials to be able to laterally move within the organization and then gain access to other data assets, at the very least gain a foothold to kind of start to perform more complex operations. So as organizations, we've got to be looking at our credentials-based access, so things like insider threat programs, making sure that we have coverage across all of the sort of key users of our environment and those key credentials, right? Not just sort of users that access the data, but system-based user accounts as well, like service accounts, for example. We've got to make sure we have initiatives that are monitoring and controlling that data and getting visibility of what's happening from the outset. Now, where you sit on this kind of solutions wheel when we talk about vulnerabilities and threats, whether you're focused more on IoT, on kind of internal fraud-based initiatives, you're looking at things like data extraction, lateral movement, you'll be on this wheel in some respects, but the consistent outcome of this is, have you got the data points to give you visibility into those vulnerabilities and threats that are relevant to your business? Then how are you looking at that data and modernizing your response to those data sets? And how are you transforming your operations in line with a lot of the cloud adoption initiatives that we're now seeing being driven? So in answering the question from my perspective, which vulnerabilities and threats should I start first? It's the processes, controls, and procedures vulnerability as a business that we should be looking at, and also making sure that we absolutely have a handle on who's accessing our data, what credentials are being used, what they're doing when they're in, and then ensuring that we have the right response mechanisms baked in as an operational security outcome across the entire business. Adam?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So I think when you ask the question, where should we focus first, and what threats and vulnerabilities should you focus on first? That it's not. You have to remember that it's not practical from a budget or resource perspective to try and stop every breach, right, or every vulnerability that might create a breach, rather. And so you really got to, as an organization, you've got to consider, how do I allocate resources most effectively to mitigate the threats that are the most critical? And I think there's two pieces to that. And the first piece is what we at Tenable call the vulnerability priority rating, or a VPR. And this is having an understanding of what the actual vulnerability is. And so in my first response, I made some comments about CVSS scores. And just to go back there for 1 second, because a lot of organizations follow this methodology, is that you may focus on remediation of what are rated as critical or high CVSS scores. And Tenable noted did some research where we noted that about 56% of CVSS scores are rated critical or high. So if you have 100,000 vulnerabilities, for example, you'll be chasing 56,000 vulnerabilities rated critical or high. There's also really not a lot of context around them. You may not, they're not directly connected to your organization or asset, and sometimes they're 2 weeks old. So you're not really getting a recent, contextually aware visibility into a vulnerability when you're looking at CVSS scores. And the bottom line is, no matter how big your security team is, you don't have enough resources to chase 56,000 higher critical vulnerabilities. So the answer to that is going back to where I started, is with knowing more about the vulnerability. So calculating a vulnerability priority rating, as Tenable puts it, to look at the recency of the vulnerability. We look at the intensity of it. We look at how it's being exploited in the wild. So what it's actually doing using threat intelligence, we use our machine-based algorithms, machine learning algorithms and proprietary data formulas that we have to analyze these vulnerabilities. We look at the age of it, so we make sure that's recent. And we look at what type of source it is. Is this coming from a nation state, or is it coming from a cyber criminal gang of some kind, and individuals? All of these things really make a difference in the criticality of the vulnerability. So the VPR, the vulnerability priority rating. But then, as I was saying, it's incredibly important to know the context of the vulnerability. And we try to ascertain that through the ACR. And this is an asset criticality rating. So this is looking at the assets, the actual asset that exploit might attack. So the business purpose, what type of asset it is, what it's connected to, where it's located, what type of data is on that asset. And if you put the VPR together with the ACR, you get a complete picture, which is you have awareness of what your cyber exposure is. So you really understand the context, and you also understand the type of assets that it might be affected. And this also can be invaluable information helping you have an effective incident response plan, because you understand the exploit and you understand your environment and how it could be exploited. So I think those are the keys to really understanding what to focus on first. It's prioritization and having clarity as to an awareness of your assets.
And leading very nicely into the next question, right? What real world security mistakes should we learn from and avoid? I mean, that bleeds fantastically from Adam's previous point around vulnerability priority rating, right? Knowing where to focus your time, right? Because we only have a finite amount of resources in terms of security analysts if we look at it from a core sort of SOC perspective, but also as a business, right? We've got a lot of data being generated by a lot of tools and systems, and we have to start focusing where the priorities lay in terms of what we're looking for in those data sets and how we're looking for it. And one of the kind of key things I want to talk about is how you kind of transform those outcomes, right? And cloud security is one of them, but let's talk about this from an overall security perspective. You know, the common mistakes that are being made in the industry, apart from some of the key things we talked about earlier, you know, operationalizing security, baking in security into your DevOps processes, your software development lifecycle, making everybody in the business a stakeholder for your security practices and frameworks. All these things are a constant given in making sure that we avoid the mistakes from old. But where do we kind of get better at that? How do we transform our capability as an organization to do that? Well, it all starts with convergence of your data sets, right? You have to have processes that essentially understand what your key data sources are, what your key assets are, and how they're aligned to what your business does, how it operates, and what drives the outcomes of your business, and bringing that data together in a way that's accessible by the relevant tools and teams to be able to provide the outcomes you want. And you know, that's going to be compliance, security, risk operations, governance, and all these other things that help kind of keep the oils of the business cogs sort of moving in the right direction. But then you've got to take that data, you've got to do something with it. You can't just kind of apply a manual questioning a lens or optic over this data. So you have to kind of start turning to things like machine learning and automation in where it makes sense, of course, right? Because it doesn't make sense for all data sets, and start analyzing this data for behavior in a way that allows you to prioritize those risks and those vulnerabilities that you're seeing. And also in a way that looks at this data from an on-prem perspective, from a cloud, and of course, for most of our organizations now in a hybrid. And once you get to that point, once you start to trust the capabilities in data science and machine learning, and you start to understand that actually there's a very high degree of accuracy, and when implemented correctly with the right context, you start to get to a point where you can avoid the mistakes of old. I mean, if we go back to three of probably the biggest breaches over the past sort of couple of decades, 15 years or so, I mean, if we look at Equifax, for instance, you know, there was a software vulnerability in Apache Struts, and that allowed sort of disclosing of particular information, which kind of led to systems that weren't patched correctly, which was one of the breach points, right? Then Capital One as another good example. the alleged perpetrator was a software engineer, right, based in the US, and they managed to breach an AWS S3 storage bucket through a fairly targeted attack. But the root cause there was a misconfigured firewall, and then target itself was sort of through a third party. And again, all of these attacks are a very common sort of denominator. All the data was there. We had the ability to pick it up and respond to it, and a lot of it was based around sort of credentials-based access. So if we're looking at avoiding mistakes of old, it's about making sure that we have the right systems and capabilities in place to look at all of that data, to make sense of it very quickly, using automation techniques where it makes sense, and then more importantly, baking that into a well-defined process of response, investigation, and eventually mitigation when it comes to start to deal with it at a functional basis. Adam?
So I'm going to offer, I'm going to share from my own, maybe sometimes embarrassing experience, 2 mistakes I made or organizations I was involved with that both followed these mistakes in some way. And actually, I was doing a webinar recently, and I took a little poll of about 100 persons I was talking with, and 85% of them said that they are also see these same mistakes in their organization. So I think the first biggest mistake that I see is a blind capacity building approach to risk-based or to vulnerability management. So blind capacity building. Most often you see this as evidenced by something we all are probably familiar with, the RAG score, the red, amber, green score. And it's something like you identify what you think is a risk. Let's say, I don't know, privileged access management. You implement a tool, and in the second quarter, the tool's halfway implemented. You change the color of your little milestone ball on your chart to amber, yellow, and then at the end of the year, you fully implemented your tool, and now you've changed the color to green, and you say you successfully controlled the risk and mitigated it. But really, this approach is completely blind to whether or not that control is actually effective or whether you're actually adding value and reducing risk. You've just made a measurement of the fact that you've deployed a tool. You don't even really have an effective measurement as to whether the risk, this generic risk that you picked, is actually a critical risk for your organization and an area where you should have focused on first, and then whether you're effective. So I think a lot of organizations, and any organization that I worked at, I saw that in some form. So we've all kind of been there and done that mistake. And then the second one I will say is that is the second mistake I see is what I'll call the beat the bear fallacy. And the beat the bear fallacy sounds like this. And this was actually first time I heard this described was by a chief risk officer of one of the largest banks in Europe. And he was very proudly said his approach to risk management, he told this joke for cyber, was that there's two friends are going for a walk in the forest, and they're told there's bears in the forest. And so one of them starts to put on running shoes. And the other friend says, you know you can't outrun the bears. And the friend replies, I don't have to outrun the bears. I just have to outrun you. And so this is, kind of a dumb joke, but this is the approach that I think this CRO took, and that a lot of organizations take, is they just want to be slightly better than that company across the street. And so it's still it's sort of a twist on the maturity model or blind capacity building maturity model. But it's just saying we'll build until we're a little better than the bank next to us or the company next to it, whatever it is. But again, both of those approaches really fail when you think about, again, their lack of visibility, how poorly they report risk, how poorly you really are controlling risk, and you just end up with out of control costs because you're always building capabilities. And you never really have visibility of your program. You can't report effectively on that. So when you have all the other options that we've talked about of, using predictive prioritization and VPR scores and these things to really have an effective risk management, vulnerability management program, you realize how poor of choices those are and why those are mistaken approaches.
Fantastic. So again, moving on, and quite aptly so. I mean, a lot of these points can be taken, as I said, into each of the questions. But what's the right and wrong balance between technology versus staff investment? And this is a question I come up against almost every day that I'm talking to end users and involved in sort of breach response projects. And one of the things I'll always say is tools aren't talent, right? So if you look at kind of what boards and executive leadership teams are kind of doing when they're looking at budgets, it's about making sure that they're kind of staying strategically ahead of the curve in terms of the latest tools and capabilities. But actually, it's the talent and how those tools are used that makes a very big difference. And the way I kind of like to frame the problem is there's the security versus needs problem. And what we're seeing in kind of the new state of the world, and as you probably might have seen if you've read statistics and reports, I think the industry was always going to this kind of almost exclusively distributed working model, right, where people didn't really have to be in an office to perform business operations. And by the way, that's been true for quite some time, but actually stress testing and doing it in for real accelerated itself by a magnitude of possibly 5 to 7 years as a result of the pandemic. So now we're seeing this sort of paradigm ring very true, right? That security is essentially being moved at the speed of business, and I'm not going to say at the speed of digital because that's an old phrase that's been done to death. And what does that mean, functionally to the organization when we talk about striking a balance between technology and staff investment? Well, typical team security capacity is normally a very small subset of the overall business security requirements. And if you look at existing operations teams from a security and even risk management perspective, they're overwhelmed. And we know that, but how well do we actually know how overwhelmed they are? Well, if we think about financials, which is where I spend a lot of my time, and Adam has done historically too, the average sort of figures will say 100,000 alerts per day, and then 7% of those again will report probably more, about 300,000 plus. And I've actually seen more, but 100K is a good average. I'd say that's fairly accurate, especially with some of the UK banks that I've been dealing with. And then you kind of think, well, of those, what are actionable, right? And we go right down to the end and we say, well, if I can action so many, how many analysts will I need based upon the average triage time? So it kind of comes back to the need to have capability within our staff and operations, right? Investing in the right training and education initiatives. And we talked in the last question about what security mistakes should we learn from. Well, this is still relevant even in this question, that a lot of organizations fail to educate their end users of the risks in an effective way. They're still operating training regimes and videos that are sort of a decade old. They're not talking about kind of the new human factors element of working from home and the increased risk of being exploited through social engineering, because it's harder to validate who a SOC analyst will be, or potentially someone from HR asking you to verify some personal identifiable information. It's about upping your training and education game across your organization, but also giving your analysts and your risk management officers and those teams that kind of deal with your core data assets the right level of training to be able to use the data sets that they have in a much better way, and striking that balance. It isn't always about the tools, and that's the key thing when we talk about what's the right and wrong way to find that balance in terms of where you invest. Now, to sort of wrap up on my part, we really need to look to automation of our data security and risk operations as best as we can. And, Adam talked earlier about a lot of the things that Tenable are doing, and they're bringing in a lot of data points. And at Exabeam, we're taking those data points and enriching them with all other parts of the platforms and infrastructures and business processes to kind of give a much more contextual view of what's going on. So if you're looking at improving from a technology perspective, your time to detect, well, that's about adopting these detection technologies that allow you to baseline behavior, to analyze the data, not just in isolation against the users, but the groups and the organization, and be much better at adding context to the problem. If I get an alert that says my firewall has seen a connection to a nefarious URL, well, that in isolation doesn't mean a great deal to any analyst, because there's a lot more work that needs to be done. So let's use technology there. Let's use the power of the CPU to do tasks far quicker than the human can, to add all the missing dots and connect the picture and build out that story. So that then gives you a much quicker time to answer, because now we're able to create sort of timelines of this view. We're able to stitch together all the component parts. So in that sense, investing in technologies that automate investigation are going to be really key. And then the final part is in response, right? How are you responding to these threats? What are you doing in terms of automating your playbooks that were probably relatively manual up until this point, or have been? And then what are the workflow automation processes you have? Where does it sort of stop? Where are the biggest time gaps in that workflow from a response mitigation perspective? There are technology benefits here, but it all boils back to the capability of your staff and your teams to understand how to analyze and use that data so you get true contextual based outcomes for your business. Adam?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I'll just jump on. I thought you made some great points there, and just to add into that, there was a study in 2019 that I really liked by McKinsey Consulting, the very well respected consulting firm, and they said that following a risk-based vulnerability management approach could reduce risk by and improve the security program up to 8 times at no added cost. And often, so when I talk about vulnerability management, I often focus on that and why that's the most compelling reason to save cost and time and improve your security at the same time. And many people ask, well, how do you do that? And to tie this into training and staff and what the right balance is, it's because if you're following an approach where you're prioritizing effectively and you're not wasting time, you can allocate the time of your staff more effectively, and you can train them on additional areas, or you can prioritize what the type of work and areas that they're focused on. So you save cost and you save the time of your staff, and you reduce even maybe the overall size of the team that you might need to have an actually more effective security program. So it's clear that technology has not replaced human beings. It's to use a racing car analogy. You have to have a balanced approach. The best racing car is worthless without a good driver, but it's equally true, I think, to say that the best driver is not going to be successful without a good performing technology in a car, race car. And so it's the same with security, but you can really optimize and make your drivers more effective if you're following the right approach and using the best technology. So, and I think that starts with the having the effective risk-based vulnerability management approach, so that you're prioritized and you're saving time, you're focused on the right areas, and so you can really prioritize your team more effectively.
Fantastic. So let's move on to the next question, and this one is very close to my heart in terms of experience across a lot of organizations. And is it, are frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK or Zero Trust, do they bring real value to our business? And I'm gonna tackle MITRE because I know Adam has a lot more to say about Zero Trust, but I'm sure he'll chime in on MITRE as well if he needs to. But do these frameworks add real value? And actually, from my perspective, MITRE is a challenge because frameworks tend to lack business context, and that's one of the biggest challenges. And I think the best way to articulate this is to kind of take you on a story of analogy. Let's look at an APT in action. Let's look at some very well-known APT groups, the Bear group, right? Cozy Bear, Lazy Bear, Big Russian, Nation State. And let's look at sort of how frameworks can help us achieve a better state of security when it comes to detecting these activities, right? Why traditional analysis doesn't really scale, and why kind of MITRE can really help. But MITRE in of itself can also almost be a very confusing myriad of capabilities and techniques that can almost make it difficult for you to understand where to start, right? But if I give you this view, it might help you a little bit. So if we look at how APT 28 operate, we look at one of their biggest threats back in 2016, where they attacked various government organizations in North America. If I were to take the old methodology of trying to detect APT activity, which is looking at indicators of compromise, I'd have an awful lot of IOCs to have to deal with and a lot of threat intel feeds creating a lot of noise. I'm not saying bad noise, because not all noise is bad, that I would have to go and start to tune out, what's the critical events that I really need to go into and look at deeper. So if I just look at where this group would have in 2016 sort of scanned my organization for vulnerabilities, there'd be just shy of 900 IP addresses I'd have to have a look at in my IOC database. And then if I look at some of the delivery mechanisms, there's an almost endless list of spear phishing campaigns with various different subject numbers and types, different geolocations that these sources would come from. Then they would exploit a whole load of vulnerabilities. And we know patching is a big challenge still, but it will remain so for the foreseeable future at least. And then all of these other sort of capabilities that I would have to start looking at on a piecemeal or point-by-point basis. And the challenge with IRCs is that in isolation, they can be very, very cumbersome and troublesome, right? They tend to be fairly reactive. It tends to be known bad. Not all threat intel feeds are. There are some good commercial feeds and some very good sort of private feeds that are a little bit more ahead of the curve, but mostly they tend to be fairly reactive. And they're very sort of invalid in terms of time periods, right? So you'll find that they typically tend to, if I have an IP address for a nefarious sort of a malware IP, that can change quite quickly in a matter of minutes or hours for a lot of these groups. So it's a constant tail chasing game. But if I take TTPs and I kind of look at what MITRE are doing, for example, and the techniques that they're talking about, then I start to look at things very differently. So I'm less interested about, you know, what sort of source IPs I'm seeing connecting to my environment, or what connections my internal hosts are going to, or what services are spinning up and things like this in isolation. I'm looking for the techniques of these nation state groups. I'm looking at how they tend to access the environments, what they tend to do. And I'm now taking a very different view. I'm looking at more of a behavioral anomaly basis. I'm taking the MITRE attack framework, even the mobile or the pre-attack or the enterprise framework, and I'm looking at those techniques and I'm searching across my organization for those techniques and those behaviors. When I find those behaviors and I have attribution back to nation states, then I tend to get a much higher fidelity output in terms of the alert that now takes me down a path of investigation and further analysis that is of much more interest to my organization. And again, a lot of that will come back to understanding who might target you and what might target you in the first place. And that will further allow you to take a framework like MITRE, for example, and then start to turn the paradigm of nation state and kind of advanced threat detection on its head. Because now if I think about whether I'm being scanned from China, South America, Russia, it's kind of irrelevant. I'm just looking for scans from abnormal countries that I've never seen scan my organization before. Don't get me wrong, the ones that I have seen before doesn't mean we should discount them, you know, and Tenable can talk to a lot of the capabilities within their service offerings that kind of help you stay ahead of that game. But I care more about abnormal connections from abnormal sources. When I think about delivery of malware, I'm looking for first time that I've seen particular emails and domains that are attributed to known malware. And if they're not, if it's an unusual time of day, if it's going to a user that never normally gets these kind of emails, now we're not asking black and white questions here, we're asking very behavioral based questions. And the same for exploit and installation, right? What's the program? It's the first time I've seen this executed. If we think about C2 activity, is it the first time my organization has communicated to this destination? And if it is, then lots of these things that happen for the first time connected in a timeline become very, very interesting indeed. And you would have otherwise missed these if you were still approaching your kind of your threat detection and your threat mitigation processes with your kind of standard legacy-based lens. So where MITRE comes in is it takes you to that maturity capability level. It says, let's look at techniques, let's look at behaviors as opposed to standard sort of traditional alerts and activities in isolation. And Adam, I'll hand back to you for maybe a bit more on MITRE, but certainly from a zero trust perspective, I know you've got some things to share.
Sure. Well, I think to be a little briefer, I'll just focus on frameworks in general, and I should have maybe included this as a quasi mistake at the beginning, not a full mistake, because I think there's tremendous value, like Richard pointed out, with frameworks like MITRE and using tools like Zero Trust or anything we look at like NIST or any of the frameworks that people are relying on. I think the problem becomes when too many security leaders mistake, even though it's a little bit cliche, but you'll mistake compliance for actual security. And I see this often with the approach to vulnerability management, where it becomes a check the box exercise rather than actually the foundation for security strategy. And so often, when you see organizations, I think, that have this less mature approach, they're just trying to tick the box on the different, maybe a compliance tool, but you're really not focused on protecting your organization. So I think if you're following an effective space vulnerability management program, though, you really will be at a great advantage to compliance with frameworks like NIST as an example, because you'll be effectively identifying what's important for your business, right? You'll be protecting it. You're going to detect things faster. You're going to be able to respond quicker and recover faster. So really, I think that focusing on security gets you to compliance, or compliance can be a starting point for that. And frameworks like MITRE and Zero Trust, which I think are actually, Richard did a great job of doing a quick overview. It's hard to go into all the detail of that in such a short time, but to say there is value there, just don't mistake that as the end point, but rather use that as a starting point for your security program and part of a holistic approach.
Perfect. Thanks, Adam. Yeah, it comes back to what we started off about, talking about earlier, right? We're baking in security operations to our organization, right, from the ground up, bringing in stakeholders and owning the security sort of process end to end, and making sure that you're prioritizing those vulnerabilities that make sense. And yeah, so it all ties back really to the same thing. Even if we're looking at implementing frameworks, is the business ready to adopt that framework? Are we at that maturity level? So let's move on to the penultimate question. How do we accurately measure security efficacy? Well, the way that we like to put it is, and my esteemed colleague, Steve Moore, really what we want to be doing from a security efficacy perspective is finding bad stuff, fixing bad stuff, and taking credit for it. And a lot of us miss that in security operations. I know I've spent years in a SOC just going through the motions, looking at web application alerts and endpoint security alerts and access and authentication alerts to known sort of key asset databases. My job was to triage very quickly and decide whether we had a problem. And if we did, take it to the next level, escalate, or if I was the tier 3 or threat hunting team, move to that level. And I'd often do my job well in terms of finding bad stuff and more often than not fixing bad stuff, but taking credit was one of the hard things for me to achieve. And I want to refer to our State of the SOC report here at Exabeam in what we've sort of seen a lot of the SOC teams within organizations tell us. So we know that 82% of SOCs are confident that they've got this ability to detect threats, which is good, right? That's the level of confidence we're looking for. But actually only 6% of those were logging up to 40% of the events in their kind of data storage tools. And actually that led to a reason for that was a massive underfunding in technology and staffing and training, which we talked a little bit about earlier. But the efficacy part of this is more about these points here, right? There are disconnects between the ELT and the operational staff with the feet on the street that are kind of driving the security and protection and risk management of the organization. And where efficacy we've seen in terms of our analysis has really been low, it's in sort of the inexperienced staff, right? So, and this doesn't just mean on the front line side, also from an executive perspective, understanding what security operations and risk management operations truly means to the organization functionally and taking ownership for that. So there's certainly a massive disconnect in terms of training and education around what is security efficacy and how do we become more effective in security operations. And a massive challenge is documentation, reporting on what's actually been happening at a grassroots perspective from the business. And that's something that we can really start using tools to help us better achieve in terms of increasing our efficacy. And then you also have the ability to sort of retain your existing staff. I mean, no bigger challenge to organizations when they've invested really heavily in security specialists and risk officers and risk management specialists and investigations and forensic teams and all of the parts of the ecosystem to help make organizations more mature in the security operations. When they lose them to a competitor, right? Because they're not investing in them correctly, they're not making them feel that they're getting the rewards and the recognition for a job well done. And I know that may not be a tools or technology efficacy problem, but it's certainly a existential process problem that needs to be addressed and solved across all organizations. And we talk about automation, and this is my final point before I hand back to Adam on this. Automation was seen as not the responsibility for the SOC team, and half of the SOC organizations that we spoke to. And that's really interesting, because if you think about how we're going to get more effective at signal to noise ratio analysis, it's in being able to use all of the capabilities of automation where it makes sense, as I alluded to earlier, to help us get quicker, to help us get faster and more effective at detecting the things that are going to potentially become a problem, and the context that we can bring in from a lot of the external services that are being, that are available to us in the threat intel feeds. So automation has to become a responsibility for the business to help us increase our security efficacy. So I'll stop there, Adam, hand over to you. I'm sure you have other points to add here.
Sure. So you spend all this money on your security program, but you really want to be able to, as Richard just said, communicate. Is it working? Right? And being able to communicate that effectively to business leaders who are asking how secure are we, but they don't want a 300-page answer when they ask how secure are we. And so the critical question that you want to be asking, or I think there's kind of two related, is how do you communicate your risk and remediation performance in business terms? And one of the ways you do that is to ask, how do I compare with my peers or others in the industry, or even internally, how do different asset groups or business groups compare? And so at least the way Tenable approaches this very effectively is we use a cyber exposure score through a tool that we developed called Lumen, where we benchmark, we provide security leaders an ability to benchmark against their industry peers. So you can measure your overall cybersecurity posture with a quantifiable score. And I can maybe save you 2 years of work to recommend Lumen, in that I spent 2 years at my old job when I was at the bank, really focused on how do we quantify risk. How do we measure that effectively in business terms? And Lumen really ingests all of the vulnerability intelligence, the instances, 1.5 billion vulnerabilities that we analyze weekly, and all the data science to create an actual number, which is really powerful for business persons who are used to seeing that. And then you can compare then different asset groups, business groups. You can see whether or not, when you implement a control, whether or not that cyber exposure score goes up or down. And it gives you a really effective, simple way to communicate whether or not your program is actually effective. And it also gives you the automated remediation guidance workflow. And that was something that Richard mentioned as well. And so that can really be effective in helping to reduce your organization's overall time that you're spending on tracking remediation. There's also the ability to benchmark not only within the different asset groups, but against your peers. So you can see how you compare as an industry with different peer groups, and how do you just compare overall. Not that you're trying to build a maturity-based program, but you want to know how you compare against other organizations within your industry. So I think being able to have all that score context and having visibility in a single harmonized pane within your operations center that you can look at and measure your progress, it really transforms your dialogue and your reporting, your measurement of your program from a focus on simply implementing controls and attacks that you defended against, to really putting that in business terms or C-level terms that can justify what you're spending and also help you just report more effectively and describe the performance of your job.
Fantastic, and that takes us very nicely to the final question. And I'm going to take a slightly different spin on this because actually, if we think about our security blind spots and how we best plug them, we've really covered a lot of the core points that you should consider in getting to this point, right? In being able to plug best your security blind spots. But I want to talk a little bit about data weaponization. It's a relatively new concept that I talk to customers about, and something that I think we should all become a little bit more educated and aware of. So, we're in a state of constant information warfare, and we've really got to revisit how we use our data. And I do believe the industry still sits largely in this defense of their data kind of ethos. And this is simply not effective in the fight against the adversary. And let's remove the adversary out of the equation. Let's talk just about being competitive as a business in the industry. We want to really stop playing the defensive game and use our data to our advantage. And that has many different component parts, and probably far too many to talk about in the final minute or so of this webinar. But good defense of your data is absolutely foundational. I'm not talking or trying to talk away from that. We have to constantly improve our defenses. We have to make it harder for the attackers to penetrate and surprise us, right? We don't want to be in that situation. But take stock of what you've got, right? Understand your data and how important it is to your organization, because all data silos are very different and they've got different benefits as a weapon. You have to calculate where that can help and where you can be helped by that data. So really important to optimize your data sources, right? Making sure that you're using it strategically to understand how you can get a foothold in your security initiatives, in your competitive initiatives, in your security strategic growth initiatives. And you do that through analytics, right? No matter what your business is doing, there are steps that you can take to weaponize it by putting into place some frameworks that give you essentially the right visibility into those data changes and that data's behavior, so you can proactively pick out the identifiers that are going to help you stay ahead of the game. And we can talk about security quite easily, right? We can look for behavioral anomalies in security. That's easy to do. We can look for misuse of credentials. We can look for first-time activity to kind of show potential new advanced sort of threat or targeted zero-day attack activity. But competitively, it's actually a very different operation. And Exabeam are talking to organizations like airlines, and they're using a platform like Exabeam to monitor how planes are performing in flight in terms of fuel usage and pilot input into the controls to see if they can better train their pilots to reduce fuel operational costs. We have finance organizations taking the data that they've got and looking at things like swift financial fraud transactions, because if the data's there, we can look at what's going on and we can find the anomalies based upon what we know to be good or normal. We can weaponize our data to increase our operational capability. So I'm going to stop there because that's a big subject, but just think about weaponizing your data. Adam, over to you.
Sure. I think there's three areas I'll return to that I've touched on briefly in some earlier discussion, where I think there are security blind spots among leaders that I talk to. The first is really the expanded threat landscape. So it's moving beyond those traditional IT assets. The cloud environment is top of mind now, or hybrid cloud environments to a lot of security leaders, but also looking at things like OT, the operational technology, all of the smart devices, all the smart connected controls, any production facilities. I think this is an area where there's obsolete and misconfigured or security vulnerable devices where security leaders have not yet grappled with how to fully manage that, or they're not watching that, and it's a significant blind spot. Tenable does offer an OT solution that involves both active scanning, which catches devices that are connected to the network, but also passive scanning, because if you only use active scanning, you only find 50% of the OT devices because they're actively communicating, which of course many of these devices may be only for a few seconds, maybe even every week or every month. So it's important to have both active and passive scanning, and being able to do that with native protocols that have no danger to taking those systems offline or knocking down an asset. So OT, I think, is maybe the number one blind spot that I see. The others, very quickly, are just the context, making sure that you're looking at the context of vulnerabilities. And this goes back to the ACR score, the asset criticality rating that I talked about. I also make the joke, if I tell you I have a bald tire and I ask you what the risk is, many security people will say very high. But if I give you the context that it's actually a swing and a toy for my children in the garden, it's not even on my automobile, you realize that the risk is actually very low. And I think too many security leaders make this same mistake in evaluating their assets, as you're not looking at them within context and being able to focus on what's critical. So there's a prioritization blind spot or prioritization mistake. And finally, certainly in this COVID environment and coronavirus, we have failing to use agents and actively having a plan for remote workers and deploying agents on assets that are connecting to your network externally. These can introduce a lot of risk, and you have to have the ability to scan and know what assets those are, and being able to identify them, and knowing how that you might be exploited by all the remote worker environment and remote devices that are connecting to your network. So OT, context, and remote remote devices or agents or using agents to detect the assets that you're not aware of or aren't within your normal perimeter. Those are my top 3 blind spots that I think a lot of security leaders miss.
Right. Hi guys. So as we've run over a little bit, I don't think we have time for a Q&A today. If you do have any questions, please drop them to me at tellmemore@bytes.co.uk, and I'll be sure that they get answered. Alternatively, I will be sending out the slides shortly, along with the recording. If you could reply to that email with any questions, and I'll get them answered for you. I just want to say thank you to everybody for logging in and attending this webinar. I know it's tough to find an hour out of your day to do this sort of thing, so we do appreciate it. Thank you very much to Adam and Richard. We do appreciate your presenting. And just a quick reminder, there is a feedback form at the end of the webinar if you wouldn't mind filling that out. It'd be great. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.